Every empire has a moment where it stops asking and starts taking. Right now, that moment has a location: Greenland. The United States has issued an ultimatum to a NATO ally: hand it over or face consequences. President Trump framed it as necessity, not negotiation. We're going to be doing something with Greenland, either the nice way or the more difficult way, and the White House refused to rule out military force against an ally in public. This isn't diplomacy anymore. It's a watchtower strategy, because if Washington doesn't physically possess the island, it believes Russia and China will eventually encircle North America from the Arctic. If you want analysis that sees the system behind the headlines, subscribe now, because this is not about an island, it's about the collapse of rules. To understand why Greenland became a red line, we have to define what the US thinks it is securing. The official justification is always the same: security. But security here isn't a slogan, it's a geography problem, a supply chain problem, a time problem. The Arctic is turning into a front line, distance is shrinking, warning time is collapsing, and Greenland sits where those pressures overlap. It's the gateway to the North Atlantic, the hinge between Arctic routes and Atlantic reach, the platform for sensors, aircraft, and space tracking. So the problem isn't should America buy land. The problem is more unsettling. What happens when a superpower decides ownership is the only form of safety it trusts? Because once that belief takes root, every alliance becomes conditional. To see why this belief is growing, we have to rewind to what changed in the Arctic. For decades, Greenland was quiet, remote, a frozen dependency inside the Danish kingdom. Then the Arctic stopped being frozen politics and became liquid opportunity. Russia rebuilt the north into a military environment. Bases, runways, missile reach, a fleet designed for ice. China moved in a different way. Not with warships first, with financing, infrastructure proposals, mining stakes. A long game branded the Polar Silk Road, and climate did the final thing. Geopolitics always exploits. It opened doors. As ice retreats, routes appear, shortcuts between Europe and Asia, new corridors that turn remote into central. That is the background pressure. The Arctic became valuable enough to fight over. And once the value became visible, the first crisis ignited fast. The first crisis wasn't a clash of ships, it was a sentence. We're going to be doing something with Greenland, either the nice way or the more difficult way. That line did two things at once. It declared intent, and it shattered assumptions. Because the White House didn't just hint at purchase, it refused to rule out force against Denmark, a NATO member, a country that built its security around American guarantees. Then the pressure turned procedural. A special envoy, direct outreach to Greenland, signals crafted to treat the island like it was already separate from Copenhagen. That is why this moment is explosive. Not because Greenland is weak, but because the rule book is, if a superpower speaks to allies in ultimatum language, every ally hears the same message. Your sovereignty is negotiable, but the threat is only the surface. Underneath is the mechanism that makes Greenland irresistible. The hidden mechanism is not conquest, it's control of ingredients. Beneath Greenland's ice sits up to $4.4 trillion in untapped wealth, an estimated 7.3 billion barrels of oil, and the strategic core, 25 of 34 critical minerals. These minerals are not commodities, they are inputs from modern power. They feed advanced weapon systems, they feed chip manufacturing, they feed the supply chain behind civilian technology. And right now, China holds the choke point, around 70% of rare earth minerals, and roughly 90% of refining capacity. That means in a crisis, the battlefield isn't only missiles, it's factories, it's production lines, it's who can build at scale. So Greenland becomes a resource war disguised as a security mission. And sites like Kvanefjeld become strategic leverage, not just mining, but minerals explain desire. They do not explain urgency. Urgency comes from geography. There is a kill zone in the North Atlantic, and Greenland is the only way to lock it. It's called the GIUK gap, the corridor between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. This is the primary exit route for Russian nuclear submarines leaving the Kola Peninsula, the path toward the US East Coast, the line that decides whether the Atlantic is contained or permissive. Russian activity here has surged toward Cold War intensity. Submarines probing, drilling for access, testing blind spots. If the US controls Greenland, it can saturate the gap. Sensors, anti-submarine warfare systems, persistent tracking. It can trap the Russian Northern Fleet behind the Arctic Wall. Without Greenland, the watchtower becomes blind, and the North Atlantic becomes a hunting ground. So Washington stopped acting like a partner and started acting like a godfather. Traditional diplomacy relies on consent. This strategy relies on pressure. The US appointment of a special envoy to Greenland was not administrative, it was symbolic coercion, a calculated insult to Danish sovereignty, a message that the island was being treated as separate already. Then the pressure escalated into economic threat, trade wars, tariffs, financial pain tied to territorial negotiation. It's diplomacy by threat. A superpower weaponizing its market the way others weaponize missiles, telling allies that their stability depends on compliance. And it didn't stop at Denmark. Officials floated bypassing Copenhagen entirely, offering Greenland a compact-style arrangement, economic aid in exchange for military exclusivity, control without ownership, possession without paperwork. But coercion has a target, and the target is the power Washington wants out of the Arctic. For 2 decades, China tried to buy Greenland from the inside out, not with annexation, with access. Beijing branded itself a near-Arctic state, despite being roughly 900 miles away. State-owned enterprises pursued ports, airports, and infrastructure. Projects that looked civilian, but in the Arctic, civilian infrastructure is always dual use. A runway becomes reach, a port becomes logistics, a mine becomes dependency. This was the Polar Silk Road, a strategy designed to gain leverage without firing a shot. The US move to acquire Greenland is framed as the final blow. The physical eviction, the insurance policy, pressure on Denmark has already forced cancellations of Chinese-linked projects. The message is blunt: the Arctic is closed to Beijing, but the US isn't only blocking China, it's racing Russia. And in the Arctic, America is behind. In the Arctic, Russia has built a fortress, and the United States is trying to catch up. Russia operates the world's largest nuclear icebreaker fleet. The US struggles to keep even one heavy icebreaker fully operational. Russia built forward bases across the polar map, including sites like Alexandra Land, designed to sustain troops for 18 months autonomously. Russia deployed advanced systems into the region, including hypersonic capabilities. And the Russian Northern Fleet, about 2/3 of Russia's naval power, sits close enough to move first. This is why Washington sounds urgent, because it is late, and when a superpower feels late, it doesn't negotiate patiently. It grabs strategic ground. That grab pushed the alliance to the edge, and it forced every player to choose a survival strategy. Denmark is caught between its strongest ally and its sovereignty, and the stress is public. Danish officials called the approach unacceptable, warning that an attack on Greenland would mean the end of NATO. So Denmark tried appeasement. More than $4 billion pledged for Arctic defense, drones, missiles, surveillance, and the response from Washington was mockery, buying one more dog sled, humiliation as policy, because humiliation reshapes hierarchy. Europe reacted with payments and positioning, everything but territory, unrestricted US access, massive defense spending. Even troops from France, Germany, and Norway deployed to Greenland, not to fight America, to raise the cost of a fait accompli. And Greenland's 57,000 people delivered the hardest obstacle. We are not for sale. This is why the conflict escalated into trade blackmail. Tariffs threatened against allies, the EU preparing anti-coercion tools, trade talks freezing, then the tone shifted. A framework of a future deal, tariffs suspended, a new pitch, the Golden Dome missile defense vision, a path toward protectorate control without legal ownership. And that is the final insight. The Greenland crisis didn't just expose a dispute. It exposed a new world. The zone of peace is gone. Article 5 is secondary to strategic imperatives. Protection has a price tag. Sovereignty has a bargaining cost. So the question is no longer who owns Greenland. The question is darker. When borders become negotiable again, who is safe next?